Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture number 17 on evolution of teaching hospitals under the course Health Humanities, Indian and Western Medical Knowledge Traditions. In this course, I will talk about the evolution of teaching hospitals, how they began to shape the discourse about health and illness, how they began to shape the discourse about medical practices, and the role of doctors and the medical staffs, medical practitioners, and their relation with the patients. In this course, I will talk about the hospital teachings and medicine, and the emergence of clinical medicine, the discourse of body, life, disease, and death. And then I will focus on epistemic shift that occurred in the context of illness, disease, medical practice, medicine, and then I'll talk in detail about the concept of medical gauge. And I'll talk about how this gauge has two broad categories, the medical gauge and then clinical gauge. And then how gauge is not limited to just seeing, observing, but it has a lot of other dimensions like touching, hearing, speaking, and so many other contexts. So I will talk in detail about gauge. So when we think about the evolution of teaching hospitals, one has to think about the shift which has occurred in the medical perception during the 18th and 19th centuries, where the focus has been on a new form of medical practice that Foucault has already talked about in his book Madness and Civilization, and Discipline and Punish, where he mentions that the people who are seen as mentally disturbed, who are seen mad, and then there is a form of punishment in the as a means of controlling their mental disturbance. And this form of punishment was through asylums, through confinements. And this has led, the idea of asylums and confinement has led to a deep impact on the medical perception, on the medical knowledge traditions, Western medical knowledge traditions, and how they have been practiced. What we notice over here, though there is a kind of rationalization of medicine, but at the same time, it has become a part of state power, it has become a part of punitive power, which is used to control the population, which is used to control the people who have been seen unfit by the state. The discourse in the 18th and 19th century about medicine also challenges and critiques the idea of medico-religious origin of medicine. It has a kind of disbelief that medicine originates with the collective practices of the churchmen, the clergy people in the church, and their purpose was to actually uphold some kind of moral, ethical, and virtuous character. So it says that modern medicine did not emerge with the practices of church. Modern medicine did not originate with magico-religious traditions or magico-religious institutions. Rather, modern medicine is a product of the rationalization of knowledge. It's a product of science. When we look at the idea of the privatization, the corporatization of medicine, modern medicine also has some disbelief in this sense, that the purpose of modern medicine is singular, private, and economic functioning in the society. It argues that though modern medicine didn't originate with magico-religious traditions, it has no concern with shaping the character or establishing some kind of moral order, but Modern medicine is not solely about privatization and economic functioning. What does economic functioning means? It means that the people who are old, who are physically and mentally uh, unfit, quote unquote unfit, they are seen as a burden by the state because they are not contributing anything to the economy of state. So when we think about the origin of modern medicine, and it's also a dissociation with economy, we find that modern medicine then has undergone a lot of corrections, adjustments, constraints, and it has somehow been part of socializing medical relations, socializing medical traditions. Though modern medicine has no ethical and moral and virtuous nature and character, but it has been part of socializing or regulating human behavior, human character. So I'll talk about in lecture number 19 and 20 about how modern medicine has the power of regulation, how it regulates the society, how it regulates one's character, how it defines one's character. The emergence of modern medicine, modern clinical medicine, and development of modern medicine has led to a lot of epistemological shifts, and these shifts has been in terms of their practices, their nature, and their understanding of health and illness. And this modern medicine has shaped how health and illness has been formed, constructed, and circulated in the society. It has led to the emergence of a new discourse which has shaped the idea of health and illness. And this shift has led to a new way of approaching body and examining it through specific disciplinary medical gaze. What does it mean? It means that the body has become a kind of map which has to be studied. Body has become a kind of anatomical atlas where there are like a set lines. It has set volume, surfaces, roots, and spaces. So medical gaze is basically focusing upon like how to actually examine the body, and it examines the body as a map, as an anatomical atlas. And so there's a kind of relation between geography and human body. The way a geographer studies the geography through maps, in a similar way, the medical practitioners study human body through gaze. Further, this new gaze involves classifying disease, mapping the body, and developing new diagnostic tools, all within the context of evolving teaching hospitals, which Michel Foucault calls La Clinique. So we find that by 18th and 19th century, there is emergence of the development of new forms of teaching, new forms of study that began to classify the diseases. And this classification has led the medical practitioners to gauge the body and then classify the body, to categorize the body, and then apply new developing and diagnostic tools. Further, the human body has been seen as a space for the origin and distribution of disease. And the purpose of gaze is to actually examine this body like anatomical atlas, and then follow the let down rules, let down lines, and then the volume surface. So what we find over here, that the geographical language, geographical imagery have been used to witness and examine the body. And this transformation in medical thought and practice was intertwined with broader social and political changes, including the rise of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. The idea of Enlightenment, which led to the rationality, and the French Revolution, which talked about equality, but the idea of rationality and equality led to the further control of the body, because they began to examine the body and began to study the body and categorize the body, and accordingly people were identified who are fit and unfit. So it has led to the idea of inclusion and exclusion of people in terms of illness, in terms of some kind of disturbance in their mental and physical body. When we think about the emergence of clinical medicine, and we find that by the time of 18th and 19th century, medicine has become increasingly empirical and observational, that every aspect of body, every aspect of disease has to be observed, and it should be actually judged by empirical results. So the idea of empirical and observational methods led to further dissection and autopsy of the body, and these dissections and autopsy led to the new understanding of disease. The clinical records became key tools for diagnosis. Why? The reason is that the diagnostic results were studied, and then illness and disease were accordingly categorized. So the idea of categorization and comparison of the cases of illness and disease were consequences of diagnosis, consequences of observations, consequences of dissection. And this has further led to the medical practice of systematic documentation of illness and disease. So on the one side, there is like systematic study of illness and disease, but at the same time, it has also led to some kind of social and medical control of the people who are sick, who are ill, or who are seen as abnormal. So the idea of rationality, the idea of scientific study go hand in hand with the idea of social control, the idea of medical control. When we think about the idea of examining body, then one has to think about multiple discourses that were circulating and promoting certain points of view, or legitimating certain points of view about body. And once there is like emergence and development of diagnosis, dissection and observation, body became a text to be studied, read, interpreted, evaluated by the doctors. In a way, body became not like a body of human being, but a text, a narrative, which has to be studied and interpreted. And in other words, the idea of subjectivity disappears in the study of body, and objectivity enters. With the disappearance of subjectivity, the idea of one's emotions, one's consent, one's feelings, one's thoughts disappear, and the power of doctors, the power of medical practitioners prevail. Further, there are a set of medical languages which shapes the bodily experiences. It is what we find over here, that the bodily experiences are not what bodily experiences were, but they are the constructions of language. They are the constructions of the discourse of language. So language defines, language sets the bodily experiences in a particular manner. For example, suppose a person who is having cancer and the person is the cancer of the person is defined in terms of there is some kind of demonic power, some kind of demonic illness has entered. So cancer will be defined by this demonicness which has been used for describing cancer. Or suppose a person like who is having tuberculosis in the 18th and 19th century, and in that century tuberculosis has been seen as a form of creativity, one's imagination. So here tuberculosis is, the experiences of tuberculosis are seen in terms of creativity or one's experiences. Or maybe let's just think about the example of HIV/AIDS, which has been associated with death, or which like eats and kills a body, which devours a body. And so these terms and use of language shapes the bodily experiences, creates a new bodily experiences which the person may not have felt or experienced. So the experiences of body are not the experiences of the person, but they are the experiences which have been constructed by medical language, medical discourse. Further, the clinical terms which have been used in the medical practice, they define the identity of the patients. They define how patients experience their illness. And in this way, medical discourse, medical language, medical terms construct the new meanings of symptoms, the new meanings of illness. And hence, knowledge production through naming, they have become the part of knowledge production through naming and categorization, which means the knowledge about body, the knowledge about illness have been produced through the form of naming, through the pattern of categorization. Let us think how this categorization works. And this is a passage from Michel Foucault's The Birth of Clinic, where Foucault says, "It will no doubt remain a decisive fact about our culture that it's the first scientific discourse concerning the individual had to pass through this stage of death. Western man could constitute himself in his own eyes as an object of science. He grasped himself within his language and gave himself in himself and by himself a discursive existence only in the opening created by his own elimination. From this integration of death into medical thought is born a medicine that is given as a science of the individual. There is a kind of intersectionality, a conceptual trinity between life, death, and disease. It is death which actually shapes how one undergoes through certain experiences, and it is death which has made the Western human beings to constitute themselves in themselves and by themselves. And he says that it is like a kind of discursive existence. So death is a kind of discursive existence which has shaped one's life, one's existence. For example, when one is made aware that death is something inevitable for the person, and it will be soon. The person will begin to order his life, will begin to plan his life, or maybe become part of certain actions which he might have done slowly or later on, or might not have done. So the fear of death is something which shapes one's belief, one's actions, one's practices, one's thought process. And it is a discursive existence. Moving further, the epistemic shift which occurred because of these medical knowledge traditions, it has led to the rediscovery of the absolute values of the visible material reality, which has led to new empirical system. And these shifts are based upon the findings of clinical practices, new form of medical teachings, where gauge, where observation have become primary, where practical results or the results based upon observation have become necessary. This epistemic shift has further occurred because of the collection and analysis of data, which has produced a new kind of knowledge and has replaced the old systematic knowledge. Further, this epistemic shift has led to the mapping of body, and it has created new rules for the classification of diseases. Let us move to the concept of gaze, and this is a major advancement in the hospital teachings, which Michel Foucault calls the birth of clinic. And gaze describes the ways doctors views and analyze patient's body, how they look at the body, how they analyze. They may be in the form of anatomical atlas. It may be in the form of the body being a geographical space, which has to be digged up and then evaluated. Or it can be evaluated through different kind of diagnostic tools. In this way, gaze objectifies the body of the patients. Further, gaze brings a shift in the focus from symptoms to the underlying anatomical causes. So symptoms becomes secondary and anatomical causes becomes primary. Further, gaze enables objectification and depersonalization in clinical practice. It determines the medical knowledge. Foucault says that which is not on the scale of gaze falls outside the domain of possible knowledge, which means anything which is not coming under the purview of gaze, then they are not part of the scientific knowledge. They are not part of the rational knowledge, or they are not part of the modern knowledge, modern medical knowledge. So gaze is the primary criteria for evaluating the possibility domain of possible knowledge, domain of scientific knowledge, domain of modern medical knowledge. Foucault further warns, the gaze that sees is a gaze that dominates. It dominates its masters. Without gaze, there is no possibility of scientific medical knowledge. But at the same time, gaze controls, it dominates, it structures one's body in a particular way. So the idea of control, organization, domination becomes the part of gaze. How does gaze functions, or what are the types of gaze? So gaze is not just what you call seeing and observing. Foucault has talked about hearing gaze and speaking gaze. That when one listens, so listening is a part of gaze. When one speaks and makes other person provides some kind of advice to the other person, so speaking is also a gaze. Or listening Hearing what a patient says is also a gauge and then providing one's perspective. So Foucault says clinical experience represents a moment of balance between speech and spectacle, a precious balance, for it rests on a formidable postulate. All that is visible is expressible. These are italics are by Foucault himself. That all that is visible is expressible, and that it is wholly visible because it is wholly expressible. So anything like which is visible has to be actually spoken, has to be described, written, and then controlled, legitimated. So like seeing, observing is not a neutral act, it is a political act, it is a ideological act, it is a hegemonic act, and which leads to the further actions and consequences, controls, dominations, and so on and so forth. In this way, the body of the individual, the body of patient becomes an object of medical examination and analysis. The subjectivity of person disappears and objectivity enters. And this gauge, this examination, this observation is not just concerned to the body and disease. It also creates the empirical vigilance of the state. Let us repeat this line, that observing or gauge is not just about finding out the disease, the illness. Rather, it has become a tool of the state for vigilance, and which leads the further control by the state. And this gauge can act in modern times multiple ways. For example, like when one is monitoring one's health through digital watches, which gives descriptions about one's heartbeat, one's BP, one's oxygen level. So this is also a part of gauge. Or maybe some different apps which are used by hospitals, and then they lead to some kind of control. Maybe it can be the apps which were used during COVID period, and then how they led to the identification of the person who are ill, who are sick, who are disease, who are having disease. So clinical observation involves two necessarily united domains: the hospital domain and the teaching domain. Which means on the one side, they treat, they cure the patients, and at the same time they train, they teach the future doctors. And so the evolution of modern hospitals have two tasks, and Foucault is critical about this medical gaze and medical power. Look at this one example. This is a picture by Sir Luke Files, where he talks about a medical gauge by a doctor. And the patient is lying on the bed, where the doctor is not just observing, he is also he is studying the person has become a text, and he is not just focusing on disease, on illness, but this like gauge observation has led to the classification of the body, the classification of the disease. How it is a classification of body? Is it like a body of tuberculosis, like tuberculosis patient? Is it a HIV patient? Is it a cancer patient? Or some other kind of patients? So this leads to the classification of the body as well as the classification of disease. Further, it leads to the some kind of control by the doctor over the patient. So the doctor has primary power, the controlling power, and the patient, like who is seen as being laid on the bed, who is passive. So the idea of like active observation by the doctor and the passive. So the idea of power enters into the domain of gaze. Moving further, we have three types of gauges. One is doctor's gauge, then we have medical gauge, and then clinical gauge. Foucault writes in The Birth of Clinic, the knowledge of disease is the doctor's compass. The success of cure depends on an exact knowledge of the disease. The doctor's gaze is directed initially not towards the concrete body, the visible whole, that positive plenitude that faces him, the patient, but towards the intervals in nature, lacuna, distance in which there appears like negative, the signs that differentiate and disease from one another, the true form, the false, the legitimate from the bastard, the malign from the benign. What Foucault says that the gaze of doctor, the observation of doctor, it is not just about knowing the disease, but it has some other function. It is directed to the body. It is finding out the lacuna in the body, or finding out the negativity in the body. It legitimates certain knowledge over other. It legitimates certain point of view. It excludes and distinguishes between like what is good body, what is bad body, and it differentiates between malign and benign. So who is acceptable in the society, who is not acceptable in the society, they have been part of the gauge. For example, the people like who are having leprosy, and this gauge will make them someone who is not being acceptable in the society, and then they will get confined. Talking further about gaze, Foucault mentions that liberty is vital for the person, but liberty is also the unfettered force of truth. It must therefore have a world in which the gaze, free of all obstacle, is no longer subjected to the immediate law of truth. The gaze is not faithful of truth, nor subject to it, without asserting it at the same time a supreme mastery. The gaze that sees is a gaze that dominates. Let us repeat this line. The gaze that sees is a gaze that dominates. And Foucault is like saying that the purpose of gaze, the purpose of like observation is not just like treating the disease, but it has other form, other consequences. So domination, which is not part of medicine, has become a focal point of teaching hospitals. And then they control the patients. So we have medical gaze. The medical gaze was also organized in a new way. First, it was no longer the gaze of any observer, but that of a doctor supported and justified by an institution, that of a doctor endowed with the power of decision and intervention. Moreover, it was a gaze that was not bound by the narrow grid of structure, form, arrangement, number, size, but that could and should grasp colors, variations, tiny anomalies, always receptive to the deviant. Finally, it was a gaze that was not content to observe, that was self-evident. It must make it possible to outline chances and risks. It was calculating. Doctors were endowed with the power of decision and interventions. So the idea of like a decision, the idea of intervention became the part of gaze. And it has other grid of structures like arrangement, number, size, and how they can be seen, how they can be described, how they should be received, how they should be controlled. So the gaze has become the part of not just like a clinical cure, but also the part of larger social and political structure, which has the power of calculating, which has the power of organizing, controlling, and so on and so forth. The medical gaze contains within a single structure different sensorial fields. And so the idea of gaze has been broadened from like seeing, from speaking, from talking, from hearing. It has gone to the sight, touch, hearing has been also the part of gaze. So, for example, touching is a part of gaze because it will provide some kind of understanding. Sight is a part of gaze, like observing, seeing. Hearing is a part of gaze. The sight, touch, hearing trinity defines a perceptual configuration in which the inaccessible illness is tracked down by markers, gauged in depth, drawn to the surface, and projected virtually on the dispersed organs of the corpse. The medical gaze is now endowed with a plurisensorial structure, a gaze that touches, hears, and moreover, not by essence or necessity sees. So, a gaze is endowed with a number of structures. It can be practiced by touching, hearing, speaking, seeing, observing, and diagnosis, and so many other forms. Then there is a clinical gaze, and Foucault says that the clinical gaze is a perceptual act. It is sustained by a logic of operations. Clinical gaze is based upon perceptual act, how one perceives the body, and this has led to the logic of operations. The clinical gaze effects a nominalist reduction on the essence of the disease, because it will be reducing the body to a disease. The clinical gaze operates on the pathological phenomena, a reduction of a chemical type, which means the clinical gaze actually leads to the reduction of body to a particular illness. The clinical gaze is not that of an intellectual eye that is able to perceive the unalterable purity of essence beneath phenomena. It is a gaze of the concrete sensibility, a gaze that travels from body to body, and whole trajectory is situated in the space of sensible manifestation. So this gaze is not just limited to the particular person's body, it travels from body to body, and then it spreads to the community, to the society. It leads to the new formation of knowledge, new formation of power, and which leads to the domination of the people who have certain kind of illness, certain kind of disease. In this way, human beings have become part of the object of knowledge. They have become the part of medical discourse. Human beings are, Michel Foucault says that they are the invention of recent discourse, and they have been also bound to disappear as soon as human being found another language to describe them. So Foucault says that it is the European culture who have invented human beings, and once this secret knowledge is prowled and are revealed, then the idea of humanness will disappear. So it has led to the what you call depersonalization of human beings. That human beings are not any kind of persons with emotions, and rather the body has become a kind of objective site for study and analysis. To conclude, Michel Foucault provides new insights in the medical teachings, and it has revealed that medical teachings are not just the mediums of curing, treating the illness, rather they are the part of control and legitimation of the power of state. In medical teachings, has certain kind of power relations between doctors and patients, where doctors have been given primary importance. And so the purpose of medical teachings is to critique this kind of power relations, to critique where the patients have been put in the secondary, in the tertiary, or maybe in the some kind of negative positions. And in this way, these narratives, this discourse recognizes the position of patients and recognizes their narratives, their points of view, and which has led to some kind of new knowledge, new understanding of patients in terms of their ethics, in terms of their there's social as well as emotional space that has been constituted by medical practitioners. Further, it has led to a critique of the shift which has occurred in the power of gauge, and it reveals that gauge is not just a medical gauge is not just having medical aspect, but also having the power of state, the power of legitimization and control. Thank you.